Welcome back. We're now doing part two of our unit on marketing with a focus on supply chains, the value chains, design of different market channels. In this video lecture, we're going to mostly look at the design of market channels and the process logistics and why that's become more important to marketing in recent years. In the previous video lecture, what we looked at is mostly kind of a typology of different organizations of marketing channels, and how these supply chains are set up, and the importance of both upstream and downstream partners in your marketing strategy. So we're going to look mostly here at like kind of what considerations do you have in mind when you're designing these channels, which means why would you favor a certain organization, a certain type of organization of your marketing channels and your supply chains over others. Now, obviously, this is in the abstract, and obviously, when you're designing, you're talking about what ideally you hope to happen. And in practice, it might be different, and we need to update and evaluate these. But we still have to have in mind what factors would kind of push you toward favoring one type of marketing organization versus another. The second question we're going to look at is why have logistics become a much bigger concern in marketing in recent years? And I've kind of alluded to these several different times where people are much more concerned where things are sourced, whether because of labor practices, whether because of environmental concerns, whether because they might have a nationalistic or patriotic concern where they might want something made in a particular country. But also logistics have become more important because it is an advantage in the sense of making the process of more efficient. And by making it more efficient, there's less an overhead in terms of keeping large inventories. There's less an concerns when you don't have the volume of the product you're trying to sell, and things of that concern. So this really started with Ito-Yokado, which is a Japanese department store, and later on the Japanese 7-Eleven and AM/PM convenience stores. But it started with barcoding, putting barcodes on all their merchandise, and therefore having a real-time inventory control system that allowed them to know what they had on their shelves. The company that most effectively adopted this and put into practice in the United States was Walmart. And one of the reasons why Walmart was able to displace a lot of other retailers all around the country, it wasn't just because of low prices that Walmart made two decisions that really had to do with logistics that gave them an advantage on their competition. The first one is that Walmart was really one of the first large retailers to basically barcode and track their inventory, which allowed them to, in a sense, manage their inventory better, to pay less money. And one of the things about the design of Walmart was basically that their store wasn't just a store, it was also a warehouse. And you see this even with now like big warehouse type retailers like Costco or BJ's and things of that sort, where basically or Sam's Club, where you feel like you're walking into a warehouse. There's not a lot of design about the environment. It's not made to be homey or welcoming. It looks like you just are seeing things laid out in the pallet. And what this enables people to do is sell things at lower prices and not have to pay additional funds to support a warehouse or distribution. And so logistics in this sense have become much more important. The third thing why logistics have become kind of important is obviously with online retailing. You've gotten rid of sometimes the brick and mortar stores, and the most famous example of this would be Amazon. And the last thing we're going to look at is how public policy influences the construction of these marketing channels, because in some ways these violate monopoly concerns about vertical and horizontal integration, in the sense that there are connections between franchisees, suppliers, producers. It can lead to thus a lower level of market competition, and therefore give certain people an unfair advantage. And this goes back, if you want to go back to the beginning, when I mentioned in the previous video lecture about how chains of theaters, were looking for content, and that's how the first Hollywood studios were formed, is that the theaters were looking for content, and so they created their movie studios. And this became a concern in the 1920s and 30s, and they were broken up so that either they could focus on owning theater chains, or they could focus on Hollywood studios, but they couldn't have both, which meant that they weren't allowed to, in a sense, be a producer of content and also be a distributor of content. And you've seen this kind of reverse, particularly recently, where distributors and streaming channels such as Amazon Prime and Netflix and others, Hulu, have made their own content. And therefore, they've kind of blurred the line between what their business is and have been able to kind of exercise monopoly power over their market. So let's look at some of these channel design decisions. When you're designing it, like everything in marketing, you're starting with consumer needs, which means the objective of getting it to a channel is getting it to the consumer in a way that is going to make it easier for them to access it, is going to make it easier for them to search for solutions to their want or need, allow them to consider alternatives in a good way, and also to evaluate them. So the point is that when you're designing different channels, whether you're doing direct sales to consumers and customers, or whether you're having intermediaries such as wholesalers and retailers, it's whether the end customer is being well served by them. So all firms struggle with the idea that intelligent customers who know exactly what they want and the ability to deliver it anywhere that a need or want arises. Everyone would like to do that. That is not as easy in practice because you have supply chain breakdowns, you have gluts, you have things that are changing in the market, and you also have an ever-changing customer whose wants and needs are evolving over time. So when you analyze consumer needs, is that do they want to buy something locally, or are they willing to travel? So in some stores you have them, you could have them everywhere. So like convenience stores or grocery stores, where you locate it. Do people want to travel 1 or 2 miles? And the big change in this is a good way to illustrate this is A&P, the grocery store chain. One of the reasons why ultimately it failed and went out of business is because they were once the great chain store for the entire United States, but the size of grocery stores was much smaller because they came from about 100, 110, 20 years ago. And so very often they got these small stores about the size of a drugstore, and they had inner city locations, which means that they didn't have any parking, and they didn't have, let's say, a lot of storage space. And so A&P kind of had this problem where it was a lot of different places, but not necessarily the best choices of locations. And as people, the development of the automobile and highways and things, is that you saw these large shopping centers that were basically people who were willing to go travel 5, 10, 20 miles to go shopping. So if you look in just Westchester County, you see most of the commerce concentrated in a few centers like the Cortland Town Center, Jefferson Valley Mall, Mount Kisco, where people travel for department stores, but even for grocery stores, and they're willing to go further. So that might be something that people want to do. A big thing that's happening right now during the pandemic is people who prefer to buy online versus buying in a face-to-face. And I think what you're going to see, particularly in restaurants, is that you're going to see a shift to contactless and more pickup rather than sit down, let's say, setups in restaurants, because a lot of people have kind of accustomed themselves to going to restaurants and picking up their order. And for restaurants, this might, in a sense, make things cheaper for them because they don't have to hire as much wait staff. They don't necessarily need the size of, let's say, a dining room that they might have in the past. But they might also add on kind of, as some things like Applebee's already have, kind of a pickup or a drive-through type of delivery for certain meals. So what mode? So people who want to buy things on their phone, people who want to buy things online, people want to buy things in person. For myself, like I'm a person when I go and buy food, as someone who worked in a grocery store when I was younger, I think that I have a good eye for identifying things like produce and meat and what have you. And so I like to actually do the, personal shopping. My wife is a person who likes to order things online, have it all there, go there, pick it up, not waste a lot of time in the process of shopping. Different people have different preferences, and therefore you have to decide like how your different customer segments are going to want to access, let's say, your product. Do they want a lot of options, or do they want a few options? Do they want, let's say, in a retail store you get the most popular option, but if you want to, like, say, customize or personalize, you can order those things online and have them delivered to you. And add in services such as using the restaurant example, do you want just the food, or do you want to have, let's say, the attraction of having someone else do your dishes and someone else bringing your food and refilling your drink and things of that sort? So you're balancing these consumer needs against the cost of providing them and what consumers are willing to pay for different services. So having these in consideration, you're going to set channel objectives, which means what do you want the channel to do? So if you have, for example, some stores use their brick and mortar stores mostly as showrooms now, which means that they don't expect people to go to the store and buy things at the store. What they're trying to do is having people go to the store, see a sample, try it out, kind of get an idea and a feel for what it is, and then have them go home and buy it online. So you're seeing this very often with a lot of hardware stores, Home Depot, Lowe's. You're seeing this with Target and Walmart, where they're using their stores more as ways to in a sense, show their product and have people reassure people what the product is, because some people don't like sight unseen, but that enables people to buy from an online platform. So the brick and mortar direct selling channel, and this is particularly true when you have products that have, let's say, dedicated retailers that only sell your product versus people like retailers like Walmart that have a variety of different products available, is that these locations are in some ways advertising. I think particularly you see this in terms of gas stations, where the main reason why oil and gas companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron and British Petroleum have gas stations that are branded is because it reminds people of their product. So it's not so much that they're making money on the selling of the gas there, but the gas station itself is an advertisement for their products. Just in the sense that people see the sign and make an association with it, and that helps them, in a sense, create awareness of their product. So, all these things can change by the nature of the company, what kind of products you're selling, kind of the existing market intermediaries. So, for example, for food distribution, there's always going to be wholesalers. I think that because you need an intermediary, because there are a lot of different small producers. There's no, let's say, one farm that produces everything that you want to buy. And very few farms are large enough to kind of stock any even mid-sized grocery store. So you're going to need someone there who's going to be an intermediary dealing with the smaller producers, but also be able to get to all the different places, if you think about it, where you buy food, from convenience stores to grocery stores to restaurants, etc. Competitors in the environment, for example, if you have competitors that are offering similar services, for example, if your competitors are going on and having a huge online presence, you might be forced to do so as well, even though it doesn't meet kind of some of the other criteria you're looking at. So when you're identifying the major alternatives, you can look at things like the type of intermediary. So sometimes retailers like Walmart can access a lot of customers because Walmart is a well-known brand. Walmart's in a lot of different markets. You don't really have to have a national strategy and get your product. They'll handle a lot of things like managing inventory. The downside of that is that some things like Walmart are going to, filter or make choices about with their suppliers about meeting with their standards or meeting their price point. Some retailers are, at a value added because they have prestige, or like something like FAO Schwartz, a high-end toy store. Just by having your product in that store is going to draw attention to it. And then, the point is things about independent retailers. So even things like car parts, could you sell them in gas stations or auto mechanics, auto body, things of that sort, as well as, let's say, auto parts store versus, let's say, general retailers like Walmart or Target. Another aspect is like, how are you distributing your product? So if you want intensive distribution, meaning that your product can be found everywhere in every type of retail and sales situation, you're going to have to push it out, and you're going to need a lot more intermediaries. So I was talking before about food, that certain items like milk or eggs are sold in a lot of different locations, or something like chewing gum, you're probably going to have more intermediaries because you want to get into a lot of different places, and your ability to actually know all those different businesses is going to be difficult. If you want to have exclusive distribution, i.e. the idea that it's only seen and found in certain outlets, then you're going to have manage your partners, which meaning you have to have a close relationship, which means they're going to hold you responsible if they find that your product is not up to snuff or not as promised. Selective distribution somewhere in between, which means you're trying to target different market segments, and therefore you want to appear in certain ones but not others. We've gone over this before, so I'm not going to explain this that much more. And the last thing is that you need to have certain responsibilities and agreements, and sometimes legal contracts between the different members of the channel, so suppliers, producers, and retailers. You might, for example, insist that they sell your products at a certain price point. that they can't discount your products, they can't put your products on sale, that they can't sell it in certain territories. Um, and so there's all these different types of limitations because there could be opportunities for arbitrage to save money by, let's say, buying it in one market and selling it to another. Um, a famous 1970s movie called Smoking the Bandit was premised on the idea that Coors beer was only sold in one part of the country and there were some limitations on that. And as a result, the whole idea that there was this chase after, the bandit because they were, let's say, bringing a contraband product across the country. Some other things like that with cigarette sales and things where people can buy them cheaper because of different taxes in different states and try to sell them in different markets. You can sometimes see this where you find institutional products where it says not for resale, and you can't break it up and sell individual things. So if you get like a large family pack, they might say you're not allowed to break out the individual pieces and sell them individually. You can only sell them as a whole. These are all different types of policies that you're going to hope that your channel members are abiding by because they're fitting into your larger marketing strategy. So one example of this would be Rolex, which is, a high-end watch. Watches can be found everywhere, but the idea with Rolex is that they have only a certain number of authorized dealers, which means that you basically have to, be the type of dealer that Rolex wants to be associated with, and with a certain clientele, usually high-end. And so what's happening here is that limited distribution makes Rolex seem, let's say, more expensive, more luxury, and people willing to pay a higher price to purchase that watch. So once again, you're going to see Rolex punish people who are either doing knockoffs or trying to sell it or resell it in different markets. And what they try to do is make it kind of like a privilege to be a retailer and to have this in association. You can also see this in sometimes where, not so much Rolex on the high end, but you see this with beverage things where they'll give out free signs to delis and things of that sort. So you saw this sometimes with schools in the past who would have Coca-Cola or Pepsi, and they would have an exclusive distribution of one soft drink versus the other, and they would put up like a sign on the football field and have it paid for by the beverage company. This is not done as anymore because people have legitimate objections to that kind of school business partnerships. So when you're evaluating the different alternatives, you're going to look at just most basically the economic criteria, which means does it make money, which means are the costs of having these marketing channels producing the sales that are going to lead to the profits that you want compared to other channels, which means that if one channel is not producing a lot of income or not producing a lot of profit, you're probably going to eliminate that channel. Now, as I was saying before, that some channels might not be there solely to make sales. Some channels are there to advertise or to promote sales and through other channels by creating a greater visibility or by creating, let's say, an association with that. Another thing with channels and evaluating them is who is controlling the channel. So when you're working with partners, when you're working with suppliers and retailers, you might be ceding some control over your product to others, and you may or may not like what decisions are being made, and some companies might want to have more control than others. And lastly, is that when you commit to one particular channel, how adaptive is going to be, because certain channels require a longer term commitment. An online presence doesn't have a huge commitment, but having a physical presence in a particular market does, because you have to pay for the store, for the building. And this is one reason why, for example, you see franchise agreements, and you also see very often that companies sometimes act as landlords to their franchisees, and sometimes they prefer to rent. So having commercial real estate, having someone separating the ownership of the building from the business that's operating that building provides those businesses a lot more flexibility, that if they want to have a lot more floor space and have a larger location, if they want to get out of a particular market because they're not realizing the sales and profits that they expected, that they have a lot more flexibility than what happens if they own the building and they're not able to sell it because generally that region is declining or a region is shrinking economically. So one very difficult thing is when you're working internationally, and this is not all products, but products that deal internationally means that you have to deal with customs in other countries, you have to deal with importing it, You have to deal with perhaps local producers that might have a greater loyalty than you do. Um, and each country has a different way of distributing it because there might be one major port or there might be one very large city. You could have different companies that control things such as beverage products or automobiles and things of that sort. And so the point is not in a sense that you make a product and you say, well, I'm going to sell it in India, China, Western Europe. You might have to have a variety of different intermediaries. In some places, you might need to make associations with criminal organizations because they might have the say in how things are unloaded off certain docks, or they might have something about favoring certain retailers over others. And so these are not things that are obvious from the outside, but they're part of the informal, let's say, organization of how commerce is done in different countries. So very often some companies just have a lot of trouble breaking into foreign markets because they don't have the association, but also because they don't have the experience with the laws and regulations that exist in those countries. And they're not necessarily going to be as efficient. So something that when McDonald's and other American fast food restaurants try to locate in China, in Japan, in in Russia after the fall of communism, they had problems, especially with developing countries. For example, finding meat that was of the quality that was up to McDonald's standard, and finding some of the vegetables and food products that go into it when they can't be sourced locally, especially for things that are perishable. And what you saw, particularly when McDonald's broke into the former Soviet countries in Eastern Europe and Russia and also into China, that they were very popular. And the reason why they were popular is because McDonald's insisted on certain quality standards that weren't normal in those countries at that time. And therefore, McDonald's, which you think is kind of a budget option or not very healthy or doesn't take a lot of care in preparing their food, and I'm not picking on McDonald's, I'm just saying most fast food doesn't have that reputation, is that they were flooded when they entered these markets because they were sourcing their inputs in a way that many local companies and local restaurants were not. So one example of this is Avon, which in the United States is sold door to door and sold through social networks. They were not allowed to do this in China. One, because China is a command economy, and China didn't really like the idea of a face-to-face marketing approach. And so what Avon did is they adapted, and this is very common, I think, in a lot of Asian countries, is that you abandon kind of these face-to-face, women selling to women in these parties or through a social network, and they kind of created these kiosks in large shopping centers. And so you won't see Avon work doing this in the United States, but you see that Avon adapted its distribution channel to an international market. Some other things that internationally, so things like heavy equipment such as Caterpillar, Komatsu, because the demand for these types of large machines and construction machines is universal around the world. And as a result, they only come from from a few places, and you have to be able to work with a variety of different governments because everyone's doing construction or earth moving or public works and infrastructure. They may not need some of this equipment long term, but they're looking to rent it for particular projects and jobs. And so you have to have a presence and deal with foreign countries and looking for local dealers that might, in a sense, be your sales force in the local country. So let me just go back and just give a history lesson. So I'm sure you learned about in global history about the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, and when they created their trading networks all around the world. One very common way that these were set up is that they were husband-wife teams. So when you created a trading post in Singapore or southern China or Japan, what you often had was a European husband who was a trader and kind of sourced that, would marry a local woman, and she would kind of run the individual trading post. And so really what often happened is that the face that locals were seeing when they were interacting with some of these European trading companies in the 17 and 1800s is they were seeing a local face and usually having a local connection, and usually a family network where the husband was managing, let's say, the sourcing of the goods that were being traded from other mostly from European manufacturing. So going to our third question, public policy has a big influence on how you're organizing these market channels because if you are setting up something that's exclusionary or something that is keeping other firms, so if I'm a retailer and I'm using my market, like if I was Amazon and it was basically saying I'm not selling certain products made by certain companies when I'm favoring other companies, or I'm selling them at different terms and different prices, these can be the sources of, let's say, these can be sources of like sanctions from government agencies. So one thing that's alleged and probably not true is that Trump is saying that Amazon is getting a sweetheart rate for delivery through the U.S. Post Office, not available to its competitors, who are the distribution channels. So something like UPS or FedEx or DHL, and because the post office is charging lower rates for packages, this gives Amazon an advantage. And so the idea that if you're doing something like that, you might see government intervene because the Clayton Act, which you learn about in U.S. history, put limits or standards that you can't have exclusive distribution, exclusive dealing, exclusive territorial agreements, and things that bind people that restrict commerce. And so some of these networks or franchise agreements or supply chains could run afoul of some of these laws. Although I will say that antitrust enforcement has been selective at best and absent more often than in the recent years. So going to our second question, we're going to talk a little bit more about logistics. And logistics is just how you actually get physical products from one place to another, how you store them, how you transport them, and how they are put together at different points in the production and supply chain, and how they eventually arrive in the customer's hands. And a lot of things in supply chain management is becoming more and more important in a globalized world where things are coming, simple things such as clothing and food are being sourced all around the world. And what's revealed us even more during this pandemic is how this can be interrupted, and how dependent we are on people from all across the world that we don't really think we have an association with, because we don't see all the steps or all the links in the supply chain. So logistics is really about, in a sense, where things are coming from, how they're being stored, and how they're going to be transported prior to the sale to the customer. So we might look at supply chain management as, let's put ourselves in the position of a particular company. You have suppliers, and then how you are sourcing things, raw materials, different inventories. We can talk about the inbound logistics. And then we can say how we sell things, which means we are sending them out to warehouses, wholesalers, retailers, and then those resellers are getting them to the customers. Now, this can be sometimes an issue for the customer, because let's say you buy a product and you're not happy with it. And who exactly do you go to get a return or make a complaint? You deal with a local store. Your local store may or may not have a policy. They might just be an agent, or probably the best example is Amazon. Amazon has a variety of different products that they sell, and they have to call and curate, what they're going to be offering. And sometimes they've taken things off the market because of customer complaints, particularly, let's say, certain products that might be offensive to others, but also that might have safety or environmental or other concerns from the customers. You've seen a greater emphasis placed on logistics in recent years because the greater efficiency that comes with not paying for warehousing goods and inventory, and the ability to trace where things are. So essentially, if you have a really good logistics system and you're going to be able to locate, let's say, where your products are on a particular truck, which is now capable because they have transponders on them, and you can follow how different trucks are moving around the country. When trucks come across the international border, the United States-Canada border, they have barcodes on them, and they're scanned as they cross the international border. You can get better service in the sense that you can guarantee delivery and know when things are going to be delivered. Anyone who's bought things on Amazon or online is, the ability to track your package and know what day it's going to arrive. But the other one is that not paying for warehousing and having, let's say, just the inventory that you need for a particular day means lower prices. And the key thing here is that you are, because of the lower cost, but the key thing here is being able to track it. And this is why barcodes have become very important, and the scanning of barcodes when things arrive at individual stores or when things have break of bulk points has enabled people to do this in a way they would not have done before. Part of the thing was just kind of the simple barcode scanners and having a system for that, but also the computing power that allowed people to track this in ways that they would not have been able to do 20 or 30 years ago. What it also allows is a lot more product variety because you know, like how many you can see in real time what people are buying in different markets and what they're creating demands for. So very often when you have these, let's say, loyalty or customer cards, such as a valued shopper for ShopRite or a CVS customer card, what they're doing is linking your purchases at a particular store for particular products. And so not all CVSs or ShopRites are the same in terms of what they carry. They'll carry different things because there are demands created at local stores. You will also see that they'll devote different amounts of shelf space to different products based on, let's say, the demand in local stores for individual products and knowing what they have to do in a day. And so very often what happens when you buy something, when it's scanned at the register, what they do is that it alerts, you know, what they sold, and therefore their weekly shipment where they restock basically reflects, let's say, what they sold that particular week. So they don't have, let's say, huge inventory being stored at this individual store. They have bi-weekly shipments that are going to restock and replace items that are sold. So information technology has made this, and that it can also make things. There's less waste in the sense that things are being tracked and you're not overproducing because you know what in real time you know what the demand is for your products. So on a bigger scale, we're part of most things are part of a large global supply chain, and if you're an automobile company or a large international company, you have parts coming from all different places in the world. So whether you're talking about electronics, automobiles, and so you have different parts made in different countries, and then having those parts sometimes shipped to different places where there's partial assembly, and then finally where you have final assembly. And a lot of this is affected by tariffs on different goods and the increase in value, and then also access to markets. And you've seen this particularly with NAFTA, where a lot of countries who are trying to sell things in the United States are often, in a sense, sending the parts to Mexico, and Mexico having final assembly. You see this particularly with television sets and other electronics that are shipped from Asian companies or Asian manufacturers. And as a result, they are inside the what used to be called the North American Free Trade Agreement zone. And as a result, they had fewer tariffs because the final assembly was in northern Mexico, and then those things were shipped across the border. And that gave access to markets that they wouldn't have otherwise. You can also see this in terms of Hong Kong's relationship with mainland China, because of the two systems allowed Hong Kong to be kind of an entrepot to the rest of the country. So when you have a logistics system, the idea is that you're going to get the product in time to the customer at the least cost. So one is that you're not paying these warehousing overhead costs. Second thing is that the customer is getting things as soon as possible. And so you have to decide like how large and what kind of warehouse you're going to have. You have to be able to keep track of your inventory in real time. You have to manage transportation, whether that's transportation by air or sea or by land transportation. And then you have to have some system that allows someone to track the movements of goods and services and inventory across things. And you can see this when you go into retail stores today, where most people have phones that have apps on them, and so a retail associate is able to scan a product and tell you where it is in the store and what aisle it's in and whether they have it, and whether other stores in the area have the product that you're looking for. And because there's a unified system, it allows for individual sales associates to kind of have access to information and be of more service to customers. The United States, in most countries where trains are a larger part of the transportation network, trains do a lot of the transportation, even local runs. In the United States, we have highways, and so trucking is a big business. And I just want to pause. I mean, people often don't think of trucking, and sometimes people look at rural areas and wonder, like, what are people doing here? Trucking is a huge part of the economy. You can more or less live anywhere you want because truckers are on the road. meaning that like they're going everywhere, and so they can live anywhere they want. At least it's their like long-term location. But the other thing is that a lot of the value. So when people talk about you know, where things come from, like where things are manufactured, whether you're buying an American product or a foreign product, they sometimes don't seem to realize that most of the value, most of what you're paying for, even for a foreign product, is the transportation. So when you buy, let's say, a Chinese product or a Japanese car, or you buy a German technology, most of the money isn't going to China, Japan, or Germany. Most of the money is going to Americans who are part of the service sector that's getting, let's say, the product to market. So locating warehouses. Now, where this is becoming really big is Amazon, because they're everywhere and their ability to ship things and get things for same day delivery and things of that happen. Um, a big issue for Amazon was actually locating their warehouses in low tax states because Amazon was online. It wasn't clear like what state sales tax they would pay, and so very often they didn't pay sales tax in the early years, which gave them advantage over brick and mortar retailers that obviously were in particular jurisdictions. Um, and so for a long time, Amazon didn't have any warehouses in New York State because of our high sales tax relative to other countries. And so if you were getting an Amazon delivery, you're probably getting it from a warehouse that was in Pennsylvania, just across the border, usually on I-84, would come across I-84 and then delivery to the lower Hudson Valley and then to New York City. Um, so when those things have been changed and the kind of the regulatory thing about what sales tax they are to charge, now it's usually based upon the sales tax of where a person buys the good rather than where it's being sold. You've seen Amazon trying to build warehouses that are closer to the volume of their sales. So right now, right before the pandemic, Amazon was going to build a warehouse near Stewart Airport near Newburgh. And one of the reasons why they were going to locate their warehouse there was that the Newburgh Airport doesn't do a lot of passenger service, but it is a major hub for packages. So UPS, FedEx, DHL all have a big presence there, and Amazon locating there means that this airport that isn't running a lot of, let's say, passenger flights is pretty important getting into the New York market for freight and package delivery. Um, so inventory management, balance. You don't want to have too much or too little inventory. Too little inventory, people are unhappy because things are sold out. Too much inventory, you're paying to store that excess merchandise. Something that came from Japan is something called just-in-time, or JIT, J-I-T, logistics system. And as I mentioned earlier in this video lecture, what they did is they had barcodes on all their products. They scan them in the store. They get scanned when they go across the register. And this allows people to know what they need to restock. Instead of restocking, a lot of everything, they just have, 4 or 5 things in bins, and they're brought to smaller stores. And then these smaller stores don't need to have, let's say, the inventory or the warehouse capability associated with them. They start off with barcodes, but there's even more, like say, smart tags that go with different products that allow people to really identify what stores are selling what products. Another consideration are transportation alternatives. A lot of this has to do with time, and meaning like time and getting into local markets. So in other countries, railroads are a lot more dense, and therefore railroads are a lot more preferred. In the United States, we have our interstate trucking system, which is where a lot of things are delivered, particularly to the interior of the country. Water carriers, I think, matters most when you're talking about oil, gasoline, and petroleum products. So if you live in the center of the country, you're probably getting most of your oil and gas products via pipeline, and they're mostly coming from the center, like Texas and Oklahoma. If you live on the coast, like California, Washington, New York, Florida, you're probably having your oil brought in on tanker ships and into major ports, and the refineries are located there, whether in Louisiana or Newark, etc. We talked a little bit about air carriers. One other thing about this is intermodal transportation, which means that when you're doing things internationally, you want to ship products, you have to get it off a ship onto a train, from a train to a truck. And so a really fascinating book by Mark Levinson called The Box, focused on these large, let's say, transportation things that you see that are just loaded. They're literally, you have a large crane, you take them off the ship, you load them directly onto a train carrier, a train car, and then you take right off the train car and onto a truck. And so the idea that you don't really have to pack and unpack like you would have had to do in New York, you had what they're called longshoremen that would unpack ships, and these ships would the inventory would be put into warehouses, and then from the warehouses they were loaded onto trucks. Now you just need a shipping container, and that shipping container basically has a barcode on it. You don't have to open it at all, and you just, let's say, take it and move it. Now, this has also led to some things that maybe are not as savory, is that people know that people are not looking into these containers, so people are smuggling individual people, people are smuggling forbidden merchandise and things of that sort. But this intermodal transportation, where docks are connected to railroads that are connected to trucking depots, has made logistics and transportation a lot easier than it would have been in the past. So when you have something called integrated logistics management, the idea is that transportation and logistics is a team, and people are working together, and you need coordination among a lot of different players, trucking, and as I mentioned, like shipping, trucking, railroads. So these all have to work together and use it to maximize the performance of the entire system. So just one thing that I've mentioned in an earlier video lecture is the distribution of gasoline and oil throughout the Hudson Valley. Where I live, gasoline is significantly, usually 20-30 cents cheaper, because what usually happens when you're getting gas products is they're being refined in New Jersey. They are being shipped up on the west side of the Hudson River, usually via either ship or by railroad, and they're stored in large containers just south of Newburgh. And as a result, because transportation is relatively short to where I live, gasoline prices are cheaper. And every morning when I used to come into work to Lakeland, I would be driving alongside gasoline tanker trucks, making deliveries to all the gas stations throughout the Hudson Valley. So the idea is, that was a design as the most efficient way to distribute things, which means the easiest way, where there were ports, freight railroads, trucking, etc. And particularly the reason why Newburgh, I'm sure, was chosen is not just that it was on the river, but also was by the intersection of several major interstates, I-87, the thruway, I-84 going east-west, which allowed for efficient distribution throughout the area. Sometimes what you're seeing is that companies are basically specializing in logistics, and you're seeing that one good example of this is actually IBM, which used to be much more of a manufacturer, and that IBM has become much more about what they might call business solutions, which means they're providing an overall system of bringing together information, computing, and various things. You're seeing a lot of, like, say, trucking companies like Ryder and UPS provide logistics, allowing people to track their merchandise, allow the people to pick up from their, instead of having your own trucking system, you basically have a pickup by UPS. I see this sometimes happen with post offices where people go in, are selling things, and they bring a huge box and they mail it through the postal system. And basically these companies are acting as intermediaries, handling all the logistics, rather than individual companies having their own logistics department. So you're having the integrated is that the cross-functional means that you have producers, retailers, and suppliers all linking up together. You can lead to partnerships that, in a sense that they know they have buyers and sellers, and therefore they don't have to wait upon individual contracts being signed. They're just going to send it to different locations, and and the logistics will take it over, make sure it gets to the people that need it. And because there's a familiarity and a routine, this makes things a lot more efficient. And lastly, you can just outsource to third-party logistics providers. And just taking this out of physical products, you see this in terms of people renting servers. And one of the things that Amazon makes the most money on isn't just acting as a retailer selling thing, is that they actually they rent servers. Amazon owns a lot of computers, and companies that don't want to or find it cumbersome to run their own server for their IT system will rent server space or rent cloud space from Amazon, and Amazon kind of serves that intermediary.